The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was heralded as the ultimate vindication of the Western project. In capitals across Europe and in Washington, champagne corks popped as the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. Commentators, politicians, and academics rushed to declare that the 20th century's great ideological contest had ended not with compromise, but with the total victory of liberal democracy and the free market. The end of history was more than a phrase. It was a mood, a conviction that the world had reached a final resting place, that the messy cycles of rivalry and revolution, which had dominated human affairs for centuries, had been transcended. Western imagination envisioned a smooth integration of former adversaries into a single global system. The Iron Curtain had been pulled back. Now, it was assumed, trade and democracy would rush in like sunlight, erasing the shadows of the past. NATO and the European Union would expand not as instruments of coercion, but as vehicles for peace, knitting together East and West. Washington's dominance was supposed to be benevolent, a unipolar moment where the United States would guide the planet toward a kind of liberal utopia. The global order, once fragile and contested, was thought to be secure under American stewardship. But this vision was a mirage. The collapse of the USSR did not dissolve the rivalries, grievances, and ambitions that had accumulated during decades of Cold War tension. It merely unmoored them from the old structure. The great rivalry between East and West had ended, but what replaced it was not harmony. It was a vacuum. And vacuums are never stable. The celebration blinded many to the realities on the ground. Across the former Soviet space, institutions crumbled almost overnight. The commanding authority that had once held 15 republics together disintegrated, leaving behind weak states and vulnerable populations. Borders were suddenly redrawn, economies were abruptly deregulated, and identities that had been suppressed for decades surged back with a vengeance. Instead of a seamless transition into liberal democracy, much of the post-Soviet sphere entered an era of lawlessness, corruption, and ethnic strife. For ordinary Russians, the end of communism was not a liberation into prosperity, but a free fall into chaos. Inflation devoured savings, wages went unpaid, and industries collapsed. Western economists descended with blueprints for shock therapy, promising rapid modernization. But in practice, it meant the looting of public wealth by well-connected oligarchs. What the West celebrated as progress was experienced in Moscow, Kiev, and beyond as humiliation. And humiliation has consequences. While Washington basked in triumph, resentment festered in the very places where democracy was supposed to take root. The loss of superpower status, the spectacle of NATO marching eastward, the visible enrichment of a few amid the impoverishment of millions, all these fed to a growing sense in Russia and other former Soviet states that the post-Cold War order was not justice, but conquest by another name. The truth is that the end of the Cold War did not resolve the deep tensions of the 20th century. It suspended them, unacknowledged and unresolved, leaving wounds to scar and grievances to harden. What looked like the dawn of an eternal peace was, in reality, the beginning of a new, uncharted era, one where the victors mistook temporary dominance for permanence, and the defeated quietly prepared for revanche. The world saw stability, but what it got was fragility disguised as triumph. And out of that illusion, the seeds of 21st century chaos began to sprout. The collapse of the Soviet Union left the United States in a position no empire or nation had ever occupied in modern times: absolute and unchallenged primacy. For centuries, global politics had been defined by balance: British against French, European coalitions against Napoleonic France, Allied powers against the Axis, Washington against Moscow. But now, for the first time since the rise of industrial civilization, there was no balance. The Cold War's bipolar standoff had ended in a one-sided victory. America was not simply strong, it was supreme. This new reality came to be known as the unipolar moment. The phrase captured both the astonishment and the hubris of the era. With no rival superpower to constrain it, Washington suddenly had freedom to maneuver on a scale previously unimaginable. The Pentagon's defense budgets dwarfed those of every other country combined. The U.S. Navy could project power in any ocean. Its military bases dotted the globe, and its cultural influence, from Hollywood to Wall Street to Silicon Valley, seemed irresistible. Liberal democracy and market capitalism were not just ascendant, they appeared inevitable. In Washington, this supremacy bred a particular kind of triumphalism. Policymakers and pundits convinced themselves that the American model was the culmination of human political evolution. History, in their eyes, had reached its final chapter, with the United States as both author and protagonist. Liberal democracy was not merely one system among many. It was the end of history, a universal destiny for humankind. Capitalism was no longer just an economic framework. It was nature itself, as inevitable and as self-correcting as gravity. Such beliefs gave rise to a new confidence in intervention. If democracy was humanity's natural state, then authoritarianism was an aberration, destined to collapse once pressure was applied. If free markets were the default condition, then the dismantling of state economies was not destruction, but liberation. Military and economic power could thus be used, not merely in defense of America's interests, but as tools to accelerate history's natural progression. Interventionism was recast as benevolence. Expansion was reframed as inevitability. From the Balkans to the Middle East, American power was deployed with a sense of missionary zeal. Interventions that once would have been judged by their strategic necessity were now justified by their moral purpose. Humanitarian language mingled with the language of markets, producing a worldview in which America was not just a country, but a custodian of universal order. NATO enlargement, IMF reforms, shock therapy in Russia, and later, democracy promotion in the Middle East, all flowed from this conviction that the Cold War had proven not only America's might, but the righteousness of its vision. But unipolarity, by its nature, carried a hidden danger. The absence of rivals bred not humility, but overconfidence. In Washington, the idea that power provokes counterbalance was forgotten, replaced by the assumption that America's dominance was self-sustaining and permanent. Policymakers mistook supremacy for stability, failing to grasp that no international order is ever frozen in time. What seemed to be a final victory was, in fact, only a pause, a moment when potential challengers were still too weak to contest the system, but not so weak as to remain silent forever. Resentment was the inevitable byproduct. For Russia, NATO expansion was less about reassurance and more about encirclement. For China, the lesson was stark. If it wished to avoid Moscow's fate, it would have to grow powerful before Washington decided to nudge it towards democracy as well. Even allies began to grumble at what they saw as American arrogance, a triumphalism that translated cooperation into obedience. The unipolar moment, then, was not the stable end of history that the architects imagined. It was a fleeting, fragile condition, a high watermark of American influence that carried with it the seeds of backlash. Victory had been mistaken for permanence, and permanence mistaken for destiny. That illusion would shape the crises to come. For Americans and their allies, The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just the end of a hostile superpower, but the end of an entire strategic geography. The dividing line that ran through Europe for half a century, the Iron Curtain, had vanished overnight. The question was what to do with the space it left behind. In Washington, Brussels, and Bonn, the answers seem obvious. Extend the umbrella of NATO eastward, incorporating the newly independent states into the Western security system, before instability and authoritarian relapse could take hold. To many in the West, this was not aggression but reassurance, an act of stabilization to prevent old ghosts from returning. But in Moscow, the picture looked radically different. The disintegration of the USSR was not experienced as a triumphant liberation, but as trauma. 15 republics had splintered away. Whole swaths of territory were lost. And Russia itself felt like a hollowed-out shell of its former empire. Millions of ethnic Russians suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of new borders, minorities in states that often distrusted them. For a country that had once been one of two global superpowers, the fall from dominance to disarray was sharp and humiliating. In this raw atmosphere, whispers mattered. Russian leaders insisted that during the delicate negotiations of 1990 and 91, Western officials had offered informal assurances that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward beyond the reunified Germany. The archival record is ambiguous. Some promises were verbal, others hedged, many never formalized. But for Moscow, the perception was real and deeply felt. The Kremlin believed that it had acquiesced to German reunification, and even to NATO's continued existence, on the understanding that the alliance would not push further into the former Warsaw Pact territory. Reality soon told another story. By the mid-1990s, Central European states such as Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, still haunted by memories of Soviet domination, were lobbying hard for NATO membership. Washington, after initial hesitation, agreed. The first wave of enlargement came in 1999, followed by further rounds in the early 2000s that brought the alliance into the Baltic states, right up to Russia's borders. For Western leaders, this was the natural progression of freedom's march, a way to lock fragile democracies into a stable, rules-based order. But for Russia, this was an unmistakable signal. The West had chosen not to build a new security architecture with Russia as a partner, but rather to expand an old one at Russia's expense. The symbolism was bitter. NATO, the very alliance created to contain the Soviet Union, was now creeping into territory that had once been firmly under Moscow's control. To Russia's strategists, it felt less like reassurance and more like encirclement, a military bloc inching ever closer, one base, one border, one membership card at a time. The Kremlin saw not inclusion, but exclusion, not trust, but betrayal. This sense of betrayal cut deeply because in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, there had been real hope in Moscow for partnership. President Boris Yeltsin flirted with the idea of Russia itself joining NATO, or at least forging a common European home in which Russia would have equal standing. But as expansion gathered pace, these hopes were dashed. Russia was not welcome into the club of victors. It was treated as the defeated. The message was clear. The new Europe would be built around NATO, and Russia would not have a seat at the table. As NATO advanced eastward, Russia's sphere of influence seemed to contract. From the Balkans to the Baltics, Moscow watched as countries it had once dominated drifted westward. Each round of enlargement was another reminder of its weakness, another sting to its national pride. The alliance's rhetoric of protection sounded to Russian ears like justification for marginalization. To many Russians, the West had not ended the Cold War in partnership, but had exploited it in conquest, expanding into the vacuum left by the Soviet collapse. Resentment hardened. Russian elites increasingly framed NATO not as a defensive alliance, but as a strategic noose, tightening year after year. What the West called reassurance, Moscow saw as preparation, an armed camp pressing against its frontiers. NATO's bombings of Serbia in 1999, carried out without United Nations approval and against a traditional Slavic ally, only deepened this perception. It confirmed in Russian eyes that the alliance would use force at will, and that promises of defensive intent were hollow. Thus, the seeds of a new confrontation were sown. Instead of integrating Russia into a cooperative security system, the post-Cold War settlement reinforced its alienation. A country that had hoped, however briefly, for partnership, found itself pushed to the margins, embittered and distrustful. The wound of NATO expansion did not heal. It festered. And in that festering resentment lay the roots of the foreign policy doctrine that would come to dominate under Vladimir Putin. The conviction that Russia must resist encirclement, reclaim its sphere of influence, and challenge the triumphalism of the West. If the geopolitical wound of NATO expansion stung Russia's pride, the economic shock of the 1990s nearly broke its spirit. For ordinary Russians, the collapse of the Soviet Union did not simply end an empire, but the unraveling of everyday life. What had once been guaranteed, jobs, wages, pensions, even bread on the table, suddenly evaporated in the thin air. The new order arrived under the banner of reform. Western economists and Russian reformers alike preached the gospel of the free market, promising that rapid privatization and deregulation would unleash prosperity. In theory, state-owned industries would be handed to private entrepreneurs, who could modernize them, make them competitive, and usher Russia into the global economy. But in practice, reform was less a transition than a fire sale. Factories, oil fields, mines, and utilities, assets that had been built up over decades through collective labor, were sold for pennies on the dollar. The process was often rigged, overseen by officials who colluded with insiders to seize control of vast wealth. Voucher privatization, intended to give every citizen a small stake in the new economy, instead became a mechanism for a cunning few to buy up shares at laughable prices. Almost overnight, a handful of men, later known as the oligarchs, became billionaires, while tens of millions were plunged into poverty. Inflation raged out of control, wiping out savings that families had accumulated over a lifetime. By 1992, prices rose more than 2,500% in a single year. Elderly pensioners who had lived through wars and famine now found themselves pawning belongings at street markets just to eat. Teachers, doctors, and engineers, once pillars of the Soviet middle class, went months without pay. Some took to selling cigarettes and trinkets on the roadside. Others descended into outright destitution. The collapse of industry compounded the despair. Whole towns, once sustained by a single factory or mine, found themselves without work when those facilities closed. Unemployment, previously unheard of in the Soviet system, became endemic. Alcoholism and crime surged, tearing at the fabric of communities. Life expectancy for Russian men fell sharply, in what some scholars have called one of the worst peacetime demographic disasters of the 20th century. Amid this chaos, democracy itself became tainted. The word capitalism, which Western leaders equated with freedom and opportunity, became synonymous in Russia with corruption, theft, and lawlessness. The wild 90s, as they came to be remembered, were not a story of liberation, but of dispossession. To many Russians, the bright promises of the West had delivered nothing but hunger and humiliation. The bitterness was not confined to Russia alone. Across the post-Soviet space, from Ukraine to Central Asia, similar patterns unfolded. Local elites scrambled to carve up state industries, creating their own oligarchic classes. Foreign corporations sometimes swooped in to take stakes in energy and natural resources, further deepening the sense that post-Soviet societies were being stripped bare for the benefit of outsiders. As this new order took root, faith in reform evaporated. The language of structural adjustment and shock therapy became cruel jokes. Reform, for most people, meant going unpaid for months, standing in breadlines again, or watching children grow up malnourished. It meant lawlessness in the streets, mafias fighting turf wars, and a government that seemed powerless or unwilling to protect its own people. In this wasteland, a deep yearning began to grow, not for democracy, which now looked like a mask for exploitation, but for order, not for globalization, which seemed to enrich only foreigners and a corrupt elite, but for dignity and national pride. People wanted a leader who could put an end to the humiliation, restore stability, and make Russia once again something more than a beggar at the global table. It was this yearning, the desire for a strong hand to restore greatness, that created the conditions for the rise of modern Putinism. The wild 90s were not just an economic collapse. They were the crucible in which Russia's 21st century identity was forged, a mixture of bitterness, pride, and determination never to be humiliated again. Out of the ashes of the wild 90s emerged a yearning that was as much psychological as it was political, a desire for order, dignity, and a return to greatness. Russia's people had endured a decade of dislocation, theft, and humiliation. They watched the oligarchs enrich themselves, the West lecture them, and their own state collapse into dysfunction. Democracy and capitalism, sold to them as a road to freedom, had delivered chaos. In that vacuum, the stage was set for a new kind of leader who could turn the bitterness of the past into the foundation of a new identity. That figure was Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. When he first appeared on the national stage, Putin was an unlikely savior. A former mid-level KGB officer, trained in East Germany and largely unknown beyond security circles. He had neither the charisma of a revolutionary nor the reputation of a statesman. He was, in many ways, a gray man, quiet, disciplined, inscrutable. But in the instability of the late 1990s, those very qualities became assets. Russia did not want another flamboyant reformer or erratic populist. It wanted competence, control, and predictability. Putin rose as a political survivor, maneuvering through a labyrinth of post-Soviet power. Appointed prime minister in 1999 by Boris Yeltsin, he was a compromise figure at first, acceptable to the competing factions of oligarchs and bureaucrats because he seemed manageable, even malleable. Few suspected that within a short time, he would reverse the very system that had elevated him. His ascent coincided with a moment of national vulnerability. In 1999, a series of apartment bombings shook Russia, killing hundreds and terrifying millions. The Kremlin blamed Chechen terrorists, and Putin, newly appointed, responded with iron resolve. He launched the Second Chechen War with a brutal ferocity that horrified Western observers, but electrified Russians at home. Where Yeltsin had appeared weak and dithering, Putin projected strength. His now famous promise to wipe out terrorists in the outhouse became a rallying cry, vulgar but effective. Here was a man who would restore order, through force if necessary. That was the beginning of modern Putinism, an ideology less about formal doctrine than about narrative. Putin positioned himself as the embodiment of stability, a leader who would end the humiliations of the 1990s and reclaim Russia's rightful place in the world. He spoke directly to the wounds of the past: the stolen wealth, the collapse of the state, the sneering dismissal of the West. He promised to rein in the oligarchs who had pillaged the country, restore the authority of the state, and reassert Russia's power on the global stage. Putinism offered Russians not just policies, but meaning. It told them that their suffering had not been in vain, but was part of a larger story, a story of a nation brought low, but destined to rise again. Russia, once humiliated, would be great again. That message resonated deeply, not only with the elite, who sought protection and order, but also with ordinary citizens who felt abandoned by the supposed peace dividend of the post-Cold War era. At its core, Putinism fused three elements. First, authoritarian control at home. The chaotic pluralism of the 1990s gave way to a centralized system in which the Kremlin reasserted dominance over media, courts, and regional governors. Stability was restored not by broad democracy, but by a single hand on the tiller. Next, restoration of the state's dignity. The oligarchs who had looted Russia were brought to heel, either co-opted into serving state interests or exiled and broken. The message was clear. The days of private plunder were over. The state was back. Finally, a promise of national revival. Russia would no longer be treated as a defeated marginal power. It would reclaim its seat at the table of great nations, not as a supplicant, but as a peer. This was not simply politics. It was myth-making. Putinism offered Russians a story in which they were not victims of history, but protagonists once more. It redefined democracy, not as messy pluralism, but as national unity under a strong leader. It redefined capitalism, not as oligarchic looting, but as a prosperity protected by the state. And it redefined Russia's humiliation, not as a permanent condition, but as a temporary setback, soon to be avenged. For a nation exhausted by chaos, that narrative was intoxicating. Putin's strength became their strength, his defiance their defiance. Where Western leaders saw an ex-KGB official tightening his grip, Russians saw a man who had restored dignity after a decade of despair. Thus, modern Putinism was born, not as an abstract ideology, but as a lived response to the traumas of the 1990s. It was the promise that Russia would never again be weak, never again be mocked, never again be looted by outsiders or traitors within. It was, above all, the promise of resurrection. While Russia was quietly piecing itself back together, economically, politically, and psychologically, Washington's gaze wandered. The immediate aftermath of the Cold War had left the United States in an unprecedented position, unrivaled, triumphant, and confident that history had bent in its favor. But unipolarity created a dangerous illusion that the great rivalries of the past had been permanently buried, that Russia was not merely defeated, but defanged. This assumption allowed America's strategic attention to drift. First came the Balkans. Throughout the 1990s, U.S. foreign policy energy was absorbed by the violent dissolution of Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Kosovo, ethnic cleansing, NATO air campaigns, and the new moral language of humanitarian intervention. To Washington, this was the messy but manageable business of being the world sheriff. To Moscow, however, it was the first taste of humiliation in the post-Cold War order. NATO planes bombing a traditional Slavic ally, while Russia, weak and distracted, could do little more than protest. Then, in September 2001, history jolted America onto a new course. The terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. rewired U.S. priorities almost overnight. From that moment, the Middle East, not Europe, not Eurasia, became the crucible of American power. Afghanistan was invaded, then Iraq. For 2 decades, presidents, generals, and policymakers obsessed over counterterrorism, Islamic insurgencies, drone campaigns, and the vast amorphous war on terror. The Pentagon restructured itself for counterinsurgency. Intelligence agencies oriented toward hunting stateless actors. Trillions of dollars and the blood of an entire generation of soldiers were poured into the deserts and mountains thousands of miles away from Moscow or Beijing. During this long detour, Russia was largely dismissed as a relic, its economy shrinking, its military rusting, its population declining. Washington saw a spent force, not a resurgent power. The assumption was that Moscow no longer merited sustained focus. That was a profound miscalculation. Neglect created space in which resentment could be hardened into ideology, and wounded pride could be nursed into something more dangerous, strategic ambition. As U.S. forces were mired in Baghdad and Kandahar, Russia was reinventing its narrative. Under Putin, the Kremlin crafted a story of betrayal and encirclement, of Western arrogance and Russian victimhood. That story fused with old dreams of restored greatness, producing a potent ideological cocktail. Meanwhile, China watched carefully. Beijing saw a distracted America bleeding itself in wars with no clear victory, a hegemon wasting its unipolar moment. Into that vacuum of leadership and vision, China began to step, testing its weight on the world stage, preparing for its own long game. By the time Washington realized that it had to pivot back towards Eurasia, the board had already shifted. The U.S. had spent 2 decades chasing shadows in the desert, while Russia and China quietly prepared for a different kind of confrontation. One rooted not in counterinsurgency, but in the return of great power rivalry. This is the true legacy of the Soviet collapse. Not the triumph of the liberal order, not the permanent ascendancy of democracy, but the vacuum left behind. When the hammer and sickle flag had been lowered over the Kremlin in December 1991, the Cold War's defining polarity vanished overnight. For nearly half a century, the world had been organized by a binary tension: East versus West, communism versus capitalism, authoritarianism versus democracy. Even nations that belonged to neither camp found their policies shaped by the gravitational pull of that opposition. The collapse of the Soviet Union tore down not just the superpower, but the scaffolding of global meaning that had given structure to world affairs. A world without the Cold War structure was a world adrift. For the West, that vacuum was filled with self-congratulation. Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis was not just an academic argument, but a cultural mood. Politicians, economists, and journalists spoke as though the market economy and liberal democracy were not only victorious, but eternal. The West convinced itself that it had discovered the natural endpoint of human progress, that its values were not merely dominant, but universal. This hubris bred complacency. With no enemy left to discipline it, the West believed it had nothing left to learn. And that belief, more than any external rivalry, was its greatest vulnerability. For Russia, the vacuum was filled with anger. What to the West looked like liberation, to Russians felt like humiliation. The 1990s were not years of democratic awakening, but of social collapse, economic freefall, the dismemberment of empire, the rise of oligarchs, and a staggering decline in life expectancy. Millions of ordinary Russians experienced the post-Soviet transition not as freedom, but as trauma. The West, triumphant and aloof, dismissed this suffering as the natural pain of progress, failing to see that the resentment it bred would become the soil from which Putinism would grow. For China, the vacuum was an opportunity. The fall of the USSR validated the Chinese Communist Party's deepest fears, that political liberalization could destroy a state overnight. But it also validated the wisdom of their chosen path: economic reform without political openness. Where Russia plunged into shock therapy capitalism and chaos, China doubled down on gradual control, marrying markets to authoritarianism. In the unipolar 1990s, while the West was basking in triumph and Russia was licking its wounds, Beijing was quietly building the foundation of a challenge to both. The post-Soviet mirage was the illusion that history had reached its destination. In reality, history was only pausing, catching its breath. The apparent calm of the 1990s was not an epilogue, but a prologue, a lull before new storms gathered. What seemed like an era of stability was, in fact, a fragile interregnum, a moment when the old order had died, but the new order had not yet been born. Today, Russia and China are writing the next chapter, each in their own way, attempting to fill the void left behind. Russia seeks revenge, casting itself as a civilizational alternative to Western decadence. China sees ascendance, crafting a model of disciplined authoritarian capitalism that appeals to states weary of Western lectures. Both powers are united, if not in ideology, then in opposition to Western-led systems they regard as illegitimate. And the West? The West is still clinging to the illusion of victory, still imagining that the 1990s were proof of permanence rather than a fleeting exception. It may not yet grasp the danger of what comes next, because the vacuum of meaning created by the Soviet collapse was never filled by anything truly durable. The scaffolding of the Cold War was gone, and what replaced it was not a stable architecture, but a mirage, thin, shimmering, and destined to dissolve.